Truman took the subject head-on.
So there was less hesitation on the part of public leaders to talk about flying saucers. Harry Truman did so in the 1950s during one press conference.
Did the Joint Chiefs of Staff talk to you or concern you about the unknown and the unidentified flying object?
Oh, yes, we discussed it at every conference that we had with the military, and they never were able to make me a concrete report on.
Do you have anything on the subject, sir?
No, I haven't anything on the subject, and there's always things like that going on. Flying saucers, and they've had other things, you know.
We shall never try to placate an aggressor by the false and wicked bargain of trading honor for security.
While Truman addressed the subject publicly, he was never said to have a close encounter himself. However, Dwight Eisenhower, according to ufologists, experienced a sighting in the early 1950s.
And the story was that he was off the British coast, 1952, and that this object, a bluish type object, appeared off the side of the ship. I think it occurred for about 10 minutes. Eisenhower and the admiral on the ship had come out onto the deck, and Eisenhower was in PJs. He stood there and watched this thing, and that Eisenhower basically said, well, I better go look into this. I wouldn't mention it right now, and went in, and the fellow who reported it said he never heard anything more about it again.
During Eisenhower's term, UFOs became part of America's pop culture through movies and TV shows. But the White House may have had more than a movie script to read.
Eisenhower was on the job when UFO secrecy really started to formulate in a systematic way. It was under Eisenhower's administration that even within the military, the UFO topic was becoming much more restricted.
There were perhaps off-the-cuff remarks from people close to the White House. In May 1954, during a speech in Amarillo, Texas, General Nathan Twining, Eisenhower's Air Force Chief of Staff, made a surprising statement.
He said, and if they come from Mars and they're this advanced, I don't think we have anything to worry about.
When we return, does the Commander-in-Chief's access to military files about UFOs depend on his political party affiliation?
And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
1963, President John F. Kennedy was boating near his Hyannisport home.
So there's a reported, an alleged sighting that he was sailing off Cape Cod, that an object, silver object, whatever it was, 60 feet across, something like that, came down, and everybody saw the object, and Kennedy basically said, let's not tell anybody about this. Hard to substantiate the story. It's something which you can either believe or disbelieve.
JFK's knowledge on UFOs is hard to gauge. His tragically short term in office left few UFO records in his presidential library.
Kennedy is a great mystery with the UFO topic because there's reason to believe that Kennedy had some real information on UFOs.
He was concerned about avoiding a war.
To regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere.
Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and all this kind of thing.
This will produce the greatest crisis which the world has faced in its history.
Well aware that saucers might cause us to start a war or the Russians to start a war, but I think he would have been very diplomatic about making sure that we didn't go shooting down flying saucers, for example.
Records show that Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother and the Attorney General, did share letters from UFO researchers with Congressman Gerald Ford and Air Force officials.
Robert Kennedy was very interested in UFOs. There's a number of letters that have surfaced where he dealt with UFOs. So it's very rare to get somebody in that high in office to actually deal with the subject in writing.
Many UFO researchers believe that political differences may affect access to certain information, and that some U.S. presidents have not been fully briefed about UFOs by the intelligence community. The same researchers suggest JFK may have been the first president to be kept from the whole truth.
He was interested in beating the Russians to the moon, but he wasn't interested in space. It was more of a competition type thing. It was a political thing. Johnson, on the other hand, was extremely interested in space.
3 years ago, against such force, the combined destructive power of every battle ever fought by man is like a firecracker thrown against the sun.
Lyndon Baines Johnson first served in the White House as President John Kennedy's vice president. In September 1961, he responded to a letter from a UFO researcher regarding extraterrestrial visitation.
Johnson replied to the letter and said to him, rather than going to the Air Force, he told him to go to the executive secretary at NASA. And it was very strange that he go to NASA, not the Air Force, and very strange that the vice president would be answering UFO mail.
During LBJ's term, military officials were said to have investigated an alleged UFO crash near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. The events of Thursday, December 9th, 1965 remain an important chapter in the history of UFOs and the White House.
There was a recovery team. NASA was identified as being there. Air Force was identified as being there. The object was moved away, and end of story. They said it was a meteorite. That was the official explanation. What I do in a lot of my presidential research is I take major UFO events. I go to the White House records, and then I start looking at who was there. Where was the president? Where was the Secretary of Defense? So anyway, I went to the Johnson Library, and I started looking at where was the president. He was at the ranch in Austin, Texas. The next morning, all the right people seemed to appear at the ranch. For example, James Webb, the head of NASA, flew into the presidential ranch the next morning. The governor of the state of Pennsylvania was there. All the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they have photographs there of them arriving, arrived at the ranch. Now, the way they describe the meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff is a Vietnam War meeting. So even though there's nothing that you can actually nail down, the president had got pictures of the craft or whatever you want as proof, it did show some circumstantial evidence that something was happening around the president the morning after the crash.
President Richard Milhous Nixon's interest in UFOs is harder to calculate.
I've talked to people who claim they talked to Nixon about UFOs. He was very interested. There was a rumored story that he had a huge UFO book collection, which I was never able to substantiate.
Many UFO researchers believe Nixon received specific briefings, information he may have wanted to take public.
There's some very good indications